In January 1944, General Omar Bradley stood inside a Quonset hut south of Bristol, watching as British engineers laid out their plan to construct two complete harbors and tow them across the English Channel. The Mulberry Harbor concept was staggering. Each harbor would be roughly the size of the port of Dover, built from hundreds of massive concrete caissons, some rising as high as 5-story buildings. Bradley, a plain-spoken Missourian who had commanded troops in North Africa and Sicily, listened with his arms folded across his chest. When the presentation ended, he turned to his aide and voiced what many American officers were already thinking: the British have gone mad. But Bradley did not walk out. None of them did. Because by early 1944, American generals arriving in Britain to prepare for the invasion of France were beginning to discover something unexpected. After 4 years of war, the British had developed an approach to military operations that was at once brilliant and baffling, meticulous, yet maddening, innovative beyond anything the Americans had imagined, and yet so cautious that it made aggressive American commanders want to scream. This is the story of what they said when they first saw it. The documented reactions, the private frustrations, the reluctant admiration, and the eventual respect that formed between allies who approached warfare from entirely different directions. Because preparation for D-Day was not simply about assembling an invasion force. It was about two military cultures colliding, learning from one another, and somehow forging the most complex military operation in human history. General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived in Britain in June 1942 to command American forces in Europe. By the time he was appointed Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord in December 1943, he had spent 18 months observing how the British operated. His initial response to British military culture was one of diplomatic confusion. The British planning process appeared to involve endless meetings, countless cups of tea, and a level of detailed preparation that struck many American officers as bordering on paralysis. But Eisenhower was beginning to understand what lay beneath the surface. In a letter to General George Marshall written in February 1944, Eisenhower noted that the British possessed an infinite capacity for taking pains. It was not entirely praise, nor was it exactly criticism. It was the observation of a commander trying to understand allies whose entire approach to war had been shaped by experiences Americans had not shared. The British had been evacuated from Dunkirk. They had endured the Blitz. They had fought in North Africa for 3 years before Americans arrived in force. Through bitter experience, they had learned that inadequate preparation led directly to catastrophic casualties. The Americans, by contrast, arrived with confidence that sometimes bordered on cockiness. They possessed industrial capacity Britain could only dream of, fresh troops eager for combat, and a cultural tendency toward aggressive action. When American generals began touring British preparations for the invasion, the clash of styles was immediate. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, and stationed in England as part of the deception operation designed to mislead the Germans about the invasion site, made little effort to conceal his frustration. In his diary in March 1944, he wrote about British caution with barely restrained contempt. After attending a planning session where British officers discussed elaborate preparations for potential setbacks, Patton scoffed. They planned for defeat before they planned for victory. He meant it as criticism. British officers reading similar American assessments reached a different conclusion. They haven't lost yet. They don't understand what failure costs. Yet even Patton, for all his noise and bravado, encountered aspects of British preparation that forced him to pause. When he visited British commando training facilities in Scotland, he watched soldiers drill relentlessly with specialized equipment, rehearsing complex amphibious operations with a level of precision that bordered on obsessive. These were not casual exercises. Men repeated movements again and again, practicing until coordination became instinctive. Patton later admitted in a letter to his wife that what he saw impressed him deeply. "These British commandos are tough as woodpecker lips," he wrote. "They train like they expect to fight the devil himself." It was the specialized equipment, however, that produced some of the most vivid American reactions. Major General Percy Hobart, a British armored warfare expert, had developed an entire collection of modified armored vehicles for the invasion. There were tanks that could swim, tanks designed to clear minefields by flailing the ground with heavy chains, tanks capable of laying bridges or rolling carpets across soft sand, tanks that mounted massive bunker-busting mortars. American officers quickly nicknamed them Hobart's Funnies, and the name perfectly captured their initial response: amused skepticism mixed with disbelief. Bradley observed demonstrations of these vehicles in March 1944. He watched a Sherman tank, modified with a flotation screen and propellers, enter a lake and propel itself across the water. He watched another tank churn the ground ahead of it with rotating chains, detonating buried mines in controlled explosions. His first reaction, later recorded in his memoirs, was doubt. The British, he wrote, seemed to have created a solution for every problem, including problems that did not yet exist. American military culture favored direct and uncomplicated answers. You did not need swimming tanks if you had enough landing craft to place armor directly onto the beach. You did not need mine-flailing tanks if combat engineers could clear obstacles the traditional way. To many American officers, British innovation looked clever but unnecessary. Bradley, however, was a pragmatist. After watching the demonstrations, he asked British officers a straightforward question about casualty projections, with the specialized equipment and without it. The figures were stark. Swimming tanks meant armored support could reach the beach in the first assault wave rather than the third or fourth. Mine-clearing tanks meant infantry could advance without waiting while engineers hand-cleared every meter of ground. Bradley did not fully embrace Hobart's Funnies, but he authorized American units to employ some of them. It was a compromise that captured the essence of the Allied partnership. Americans remained skeptical, but they were willing to learn. The British brought experience, but they required American resources. Neither side got everything it wanted, yet together they moved closer to what the invasion demanded. The Mulberry harbors, however, were far more difficult for American planners to accept. The idea was audacious to the point of seeming unreal. Because the invasion could not rely on capturing a functioning port immediately, British engineers proposed building artificial harbors in England, towing them across the channel in sections, and sinking them into position off the Normandy coast. Each harbor would include breakwaters formed from sunken ships and enormous concrete caissons, floating roadways known as whale bridges, and pierheads capable of rising and falling with tides that reached nearly 20 feet. American engineers reacted with open skepticism. Captain Edward Ellsberg, a U.S. Navy salvage expert who reviewed the plans, warned colleagues that the massive concrete caissons would break apart in channel storms. Army engineers calculated that producing the components would require more steel and concrete than Britain could realistically spare. Even if the harbors could be built, towing them across the channel and assembling them under the threat of German fire seemed like pure engineering fantasy. Eisenhower overruled the skeptics. In a meeting in February 1944, he listened as American engineers laid out their objections one by one, then abruptly ended the discussion. The British, he said, had been thinking about amphibious operations while Americans were still figuring out which end of the rifle to hold. If the British believed the plan could work, the Allies were going to help them make it work. It was Eisenhower at his best, diplomatic enough to acknowledge British experience, firm enough to shut down further debate. The scale of British preparation soon impressed even the most doubtful Americans. By April 1944, southern England had effectively become one vast military camp. Roads were crowded with convoys. Fields were filled with tents, vehicles, and supply dumps. American generals touring the staging areas saw a level of organization that made their own preparations appear improvised by comparison. Every unit possessed detailed maps and carefully prepared models of its assigned landing zone. Every soldier had been briefed on exactly what he would encounter. British planners had created plaster models of the Normandy coastline, so accurate that soldiers could memorize terrain features before ever seeing the actual beaches. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the U.S. First Army alongside Bradley, wrote to a colleague after touring British staging areas, "They've thought of everything except what to do if the channel disappears." It was intended as humor, but it reflected genuine awe. The British had plans layered upon plans, backup plans for backup plans, and contingencies for situations few Americans had ever imagined. But it was the deception operations that truly astonished American commanders once they were briefed on their full scope. Operation Fortitude, the plan designed to convince German leadership that the invasion would strike Pas de Calais, rather than Normandy, was the most elaborate military deception ever attempted. The British created an entirely fictional army group, complete with fabricated radio traffic, dummy equipment, and even General Patton presented as its supposed commander. They recruited double agents to pass carefully crafted false information to German intelligence. Inflatable tanks and landing craft were positioned so convincingly that they appeared real in German aerial reconnaissance photographs. When Bradley received his full briefing on Operation Fortitude in March 1944, his reaction was carefully recorded by an aide. He sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing what he had heard, then finally said, "Jesus Christ, they've thought of everything." The deception succeeded because the British understood something the Americans were still learning. Modern war was not just about combat. It was about information, perception, and controlling what the enemy believed. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, had perhaps the most complicated relationship with British planning methods. Known as Beetle, Smith was responsible for coordinating Allied operations, which meant working daily with British staff officers. In his personal papers, his frustration is unmistakable. British planning meetings often lasted for hours, filled with prolonged discussions of details that seemed trivial to American officers. British paperwork became legendary. Every operation required written orders that appeared to grow longer with each successive draft. Yet Smith also came to appreciate what that paperwork represented. In a memorandum to Eisenhower written in April 1944, he explained that the British wrote everything down because they had learned that when operations went wrong, as they inevitably did, having a clear written plan ensured everyone understood what they were supposed to do before chaos took over. Americans preferred to improvise. The British preferred to prepare. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but the consequences differed. American improvisation often meant higher casualties in the opening hours of battle, while British caution sometimes meant operations were delayed. The contrast between these approaches became painfully clear during the invasion rehearsals. Exercise Tiger, conducted in late April 1944, was intended to serve as a full-scale rehearsal for the Utah beach landings. American troops practiced amphibious assaults along the English coast, while British naval forces provided support. The exercise ended in disaster. German E-boats attacked the convoy, sinking 2 American landing ships and killing more than 700 soldiers and sailors. It was the worst Allied loss in the Channel before D-Day itself. American commanders blamed inadequate naval protection. British commanders blamed American failures to follow communication protocols. But beneath the accusations lay a deeper difference in mindset. When Bradley visited the survivors, he was struck by the British response. They immediately convened boards of inquiry, documented every failure, and revised procedures in detail. American officers wanted to assign responsibility and move forward. British officers wanted to understand precisely what had gone wrong so it would never happen again. In his memoirs, Bradley later wrote about Exercise Tiger with unusual introspection. The British, he noted, taught the Americans something vital that day. Rehearsals were meant to expose problems, not to prove readiness. Americans wanted the rehearsal to succeed. The British wanted it to reveal what could go wrong. In hindsight, Bradley admitted, they had been right. As D-Day drew closer, American generals found themselves adopting more British methods than they had ever expected. The detailed planning, the exhaustive briefings, the specialized equipment, the elaborate deception operations, and even the heightened caution regarding casualties gradually became part of American preparation. Eisenhower, in particular, evolved in his thinking. By May 1944, he was insisting on the same level of meticulous preparation that he had considered excessive 18 months earlier. Yet the cultural differences never completely vanished. On June 5, 1944, the day before the invasion, Eisenhower visited British and American units preparing to embark. British soldiers were quiet and focused, checking their equipment with deliberate precision. American soldiers were louder, filled with nervous energy, cracking jokes to manage tension. Eisenhower noticed the contrast and later remarked to his naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, that the British prepared as if they were going to a funeral, while Americans prepared as if they were heading to a football game. Both, he observed, were ways of preparing to face death. June 6 provided the ultimate test. The Mulberry harbors, which many American engineers had doubted, were successfully towed across the channel and assembled off the Normandy coast. One was destroyed by a violent storm weeks later, but the other remained operational until Cherbourg was captured, handling thousands of tons of supplies each day. The swimming tanks, once mocked as funnies, provided crucial armored support on British and Canadian beaches during the first assault wave. The deception operations, which had seemed almost too clever, convinced German commanders to keep divisions stationed at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after the invasion. The detailed planning that had frustrated American officers proved invaluable once the fighting began. When landings went off course, when communications failed, and when resistance proved heavier than expected, commanders understood their objectives and the broader plan. They adapted from a position of understanding rather than confusion. Bradley's assessment, written months after D-Day, captured the shift in American thinking. Americans, he wrote, had come to Britain believing they would teach the British how to fight aggressively. Instead, the British taught them how to prepare thoroughly. The invasion succeeded because American drive was combined with British planning. Neither approach alone would have been sufficient. Perhaps the most revealing reaction came from Patton himself. Despite his public criticism of British caution, he wrote something telling in his diary on June 7th, as reports arrived from Normandy. His Third Army was still in England, held in reserve as part of the deception effort, and he was frustrated at missing the initial assault. Yet he admitted, the British were right about one thing. You can't improvise an invasion. You can only prepare for it and then execute. Montgomery's meticulous planning, he conceded, had saved lives on the beaches, even if it drove him mad. American and British generals never fully agreed on how war should be fought. Americans remained more aggressive and more willing to accept casualties for speed. British commanders remained more cautious and more focused on minimizing losses. That tension never disappeared. But by the time of D-Day, American generals had learned to see British preparation not as excessive caution, but as hard-earned wisdom. The British had been fighting longer. They had made mistakes Americans had not yet experienced. Their preparations, which appeared obsessive to fresh American eyes, were the result of 4 years of learning what worked and what got men killed unnecessarily. In a letter to Marshall, written weeks after D-Day, Eisenhower summarized the lesson clearly. Preparation, he wrote, was not the opposite of aggression. It was what made aggression possible. You could not advance effectively without knowing where you were going, what you would face, and what you would do when plans collapsed. The Mulberry harbors, the swimming tanks, the deception operations, the exhaustive planning, the detailed briefings, and the specialized equipment had all seemed excessive or unrealistic when American generals first encountered them, yet nearly all of it worked. Not perfectly. Nothing in war ever does. But well enough to land hundreds of thousands of men on the most heavily defended coastline in Europe and establish a foothold that could not be pushed back into the sea. The American generals who arrived in Britain, skeptical of British methods, left with deep respect for an ally who had learned, through painful experience, how to prepare for the chaos of combat. They did not adopt every British practice. American military culture remained distinct, more aggressive, more improvisational, and more willing to accept risk. But they learned that preparation and aggression were not opposites. They were partners. When Bradley returned to the United States after the war, he was asked about Allied cooperation. His response was diplomatic but revealing. Americans, he said, taught the British to punch harder. The British taught Americans to aim better. The statement was not entirely accurate, but it captured something essential about what happened when American generals encountered British preparations for D-Day. They saw an ally who had learned to wage war through bitter experience, who developed methods that seemed strange but were grounded in hard lessons, who prepared obsessively because they understood the cost of improvisation, who built artificial harbors because they knew logistics won wars, who created swimming tanks because they had learned that armor support in the first wave saved infantry lives, who planned deception operations because they understood that information could be as deadly as bullets. American generals arrived in Britain confident in their own methods. They left with respect for an ally whose approach was different, but equally valid. That respect, the willingness to learn from one another despite cultural differences and personal friction, proved as important to the success of D-Day as any harbor, tank, or battle plan. The preparations for D-Day were not merely about assembling an invasion force. They were about two nations learning how to fight together, combining American industrial power and aggressive spirit with British experience and meticulous planning. What American generals said when they first saw British preparations evolved from disbelief to frustration, from frustration to respect, and finally to genuine admiration. The invasion of Normandy succeeded for many reasons: the courage of soldiers on the beaches, air superiority, naval power, and industrial capacity. But it also succeeded because American and British commanders learned to respect each other's approaches, to blend different military cultures into a unified command, and to recognize that there were multiple paths to victory. When American generals saw Britain's D-Day preparations, they glimpsed the future of warfare, not just specific innovations, but the principle behind them, that modern war demanded preparation on a scale previously unimaginable, that details mattered, that logistics shaped strategy, that deception could rival firepower, and that allies who learned from one another were stronger than those who merely fought side by side. That was the real lesson, not any single quote or reaction, but the journey from skepticism to respect, from confidence in one's own methods to appreciation of an ally's hard-earned wisdom, and from seeing differences as obstacles to recognizing them as strengths. The Allied victory in Normandy rested on many foundations, but one of the most important was the willingness of American and British commanders to learn from each other, to combine their strengths, and to forge unity from two very different military cultures.